Good afternoon. I'm Don Martin, the Executive Vice President of Ceres, a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on the climate crisis, water risk, deforestation, and equitable workplaces. I want to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all of those so seriously impacted by the global pandemic. And we're especially grateful to those on the front lines, risking so much and working so hard to ensure that we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to sincerely thank each of you for joining us. We realize that your lives and businesses have been disrupted in ways that we could have never imagined just a few weeks ago, and yet you are persevering. The success of this effort to transform the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk to a digital program is a testament to the conviction we all share to address the dual existential threats that are plaguing our global community. Science overwhelmingly confirms what has been unfolding right before our eyes. Challenges like extreme droughts, floods, fires, and even the spread of infectious disease are being fueled by the climate crisis and deforestation. The good news is that some of the solutions, like ensuring the resiliency of forests to capture carbon and lessen the outbreak of disease, are within our reach. So we stand by to support you, investors and companies, when the time is right, to propel quicker, high-impact solutions. You are in the driver's seat, and your passengers are counting on you. Together, we will map out critical steps necessary to tackle the climate crisis in new ways in our new reality. So today, as we begin our dialogue, I want to give special thanks to our co-hosts, the United Nations Foundation and the United Nations Office of Partnerships. I also want to note that this digital program wouldn't have been possible without our speakers, sponsors, and participants. Speakers like Mark Carney, who volunteered to join us before we even had to ask. Thanks to him and to all of you who have encouraged us along this digital journey. We will begin this program with some opening remarks, and then there'll be a Q&A period with Mr. Carney. If you have any questions for him, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel. Please also note that this program is being recorded, and all participants will receive a link to the recording shortly after the webinar. With that, it's now my great pleasure to introduce the CEO and President of Ceres, Mindy Luber.
Great. Don, thank you. And friends, and I count all of you as friends who are joining us, thanks for joining. And thanks for everything you're doing. I know that we are all suffering this moment of a pandemic. I know you're each doing everything you can to protect your families, your pensioners, your employees, and your communities. And for that, my heartfelt thanks. This pandemic gives us some cause for obvious concern and to think about what a painful reminder of our vulnerability to systemic shocks we have. The pandemic clearly is showing us shocks hit the system and profoundly impact us. They also show us of our interconnectedness to the world and of the need for mass mobilization to tackle a crisis, whether driven by the coronavirus or by climate change. Hopefully in the weeks and months to come, we'll learn some lessons from this crisis, and hopefully we'll strengthen our systems and our policies to better protect our society and to actually build the sustainable future that we're all working so hard to do. Now, if there's one thing history has shown us, and it's that a crisis can and often does produce real change. The power of collective action will become evident, true leaders will emerge, and the impossible will become inevitable. Innovative ideas and policy solutions will take hold, save lives, and eventually get our economy back on track. And while some of our efforts to address the climate crisis might be slowed down for a very short period of time, our overall message that I know we all share is we simply can't lose our overall momentum. We've got to keep moving, doing what we can do, while clearly noting this moment in time. Together, we've made extraordinary progress, and with continued collaboration and focus, I've no doubt we can and will pick up that momentum that we've shared together, and we'll pick it up soon. Consider this. In the last year, many of us worked together to move 100 companies who announced plans to align their businesses with a 1.5-degree future, and many more in the pipeline to come. And many of our partners in the institutional investment community and beyond divested from coal and invested billions of dollars into a clean energy future. And the world's largest asset manager affirmed that thermal coal is becoming less and less economically viable. And there was no better evidence of our progress than last year as we built the powerful investor-led Climate Action 100 initiative, which grew to 450 investors, sending a strong signal to the world's largest emitters to cut their emissions. Each and every one of those 450 investors are standing with us to call on their portfolio companies to act, and act now on the climate crisis. Past year, though, also brought a bit more destruction and devastation both to our planet and our economy, and we can't ignore that. The US lost $45 billion in 2019 alone and suffered more than $500 billion in losses in the last 5 years, all from extreme weather, flooding, drought, and fires. And now we're faced with a pandemic that will further exacerbate our economic challenges. We know that. And all of this is happening faster than we can act. So we need to be ready. We need to be even better prepared for the next crisis, because it will strike. Moving companies one by one, as we've done for years, is simply not fast enough. We need our capital market systems and policies to change in order to accelerate action at a pace and at a scale required. Our accelerator, the Series Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets, is enabling us to strengthen capital market systems and policies. We're working to move the US financial regulators to recognize and act on climate change as the systemic financial risk that it is. It's time we caught up to what Mark Carney has been doing and the leadership he's been showing. And whether the Federal Reserve or the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Commodities Future Trading Commission or state banking and insurance regulators, each and every one of them have a clear responsibility to act, and the work through our accelerator is doing just that. And credit rating agencies must fully integrate climate risk into their analysis and ratings. And the banking and insurance industries, along with asset owners and asset managers, also have a unique ability to drive climate action and to do so faster than they have in the past. They touch every sector of our economy. Every loan, every investment is a choice now about our future. And in the coming year, we will rebuild our economy. We will work with investors to help navigate the climate risks and opportunities in this new world. We have a framework. It's called the Investor Agenda. It includes 4 clear and key actions. The first action of our investor agenda encourages investors to integrate climate change into their investment decisions and portfolio analysis. Each investor should achieve a Paris-aligned portfolio. That's the design, that's the framework, that's where we need to go. And the second focus area calls on investors to be bolder, engaging with their portfolio companies, calling on every one of the high-emitting companies in their portfolio to reduce their emissions, improve transparency, and make sure their boards are holding them accountable as well. And we're getting enormous progress and change from this effort. The third focus area asks investors to improve their own climate risk disclosures. We've got good models out there, the TCFD and others, let's use them. And the fourth focus area urges investors, each and every one of us and every one of you, to support public policies such as phasing out thermal coal, scaling up clean energy investments, and putting a price on carbon pollution. Right now, investors can help, and we'll be in touch to give you the details on how we can make sure the economic stimulus packages being discussed not only address what they need to most address, the life-saving immediate needs of this pandemic, but where there are options, we want to make sure these investments also support the shift to a net zero emissions economy. What you do every single person on this call and every investor and company we work with makes an extraordinary difference. What you do matters. Your voices are well respected. We need you to be visible, speak up, let your word and your vision guide the way for others, so that when our children and grandchildren turn to us and ask us what we did to tackle the climate crisis, we don't want to have to worry about telling them that we failed them. Failure is simply not an option. Let's keep the momentum going, fully recognizing the crisis we're living in. We can do what we can do. I urge us to keep working together, and we'll get there. Thank you all so much for all that you've been doing as partners to assure a clean energy future. And now it's my great personal pleasure to introduce my partner in hosting the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk, the United Nations Foundation President and CEO Elizabeth Cousins, who will provide opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Thank you for your leadership, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you are all safe and well, and we are so grateful that you're with us and that we can hold this session even amid such a challenging time for everyone. You know, our collaboration with Mindy and with Ceres goes back 18 years, almost as long as the UN Foundation has been around. And it's a partnership that has stood the test of time because we are both so committed to the notion that the biggest collective challenges we face, whether it's coronavirus that we're all battling now in an unprecedented way, or whether it's climate change, need all of us to be a part of the solution, crucially, including the private sector. That conviction underpins everything that we do at the UN Foundation. In fact, across all the issues on which we work to support the UN, including now coronavirus, and it has always characterized our work on climate change. This is a unique inflection point in the world. The fundamentals of our systems are under unprecedented duress, and the interconnectedness of our most vital systems, whether it's food or energy, climate, or our economies, has never been more apparent. And we face pressures and strains that cut across and threaten them all, and at an accelerating speed. At the same time, it's never been clearer that the solutions we need are interlinked too, and they're mutually reinforcing, which creates opportunities for more rapid progress than most people realize. Now, one of the people who has both recognized these opportunities and worked to make rapid and concrete progress is the person I have the honor of introducing today, Mark Carney. There really is no better person to talk to us today about how we mobilize finance and the financial system for a net zero economy than Mark. Mark, as you all know, just stepped down not too long ago as governor of the Bank of England, a position he held since 2013. He was previously governor of Canada's central bank for more than 5 years and an investment banker with Goldman Sachs for over a decade before that. Mark also chaired from 2011 to 2018 the Financial Stability Board, the international body that monitors and assesses vulnerabilities across the global financial system. Well, now he has stepped into 2 significant new roles. He was recently named the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Climate, a role we at the UN Foundation look very forward to seeing him play. And this year he serves also as Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor on finance for COP26, an invaluable dual role that reflects the imperative of ambitious action across the global financial system to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. This year in particular, Mark will have the opportunity to connect the great work he has long done on climate change in the financial community with key momentum coming out of the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit last September. In particular, the ambitious commitment made by a number of investors through initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to align investment portfolios with net zero emissions trajectories. We're incredibly pleased to have Mark with us today, despite these difficult and painful circumstances. And we all look forward to hearing Mark's insights and to working with him closely at the United Nations, with the United Kingdom this year and beyond to make the urgent progress we so need. Mark, over to you, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you all for joining. And may I add my best wishes to everyone and their families during this challenging time. I really should start by acknowledging both the immediate health and economic crises that we are facing. I hope you can still hear me since I've just dropped off. And I want to underscore that the main questions from an economic perspective that we face is concerned not so much the depth of the decline in output in the short term, but how. I'm just checking, Elizabeth, if I'm back. Yeah, okay. I just want to underscore, I'm going to start on the economic, just say a couple quick words on that, which is the first thing is that the issue is not so much the decline in short term of output, but is the ability to preserve the productive capacity of our economies and maintain the livelihoods of our citizens. And that's why central banks and governments are taking such unprecedented measures to bridge to the other side of what is an enormous but ultimately temporary shock. Now, those national actions are critical, but this is a global crisis. It requires international cooperation and coordination. And in fact, what it really requires is solidarity at all levels. So solidarity at an individual level with our immediate family members, solidarity within our communities, solidarity between banks and their clients, companies with their employees, their suppliers and customers. And that's what will bring success to the health crisis and the associated economic shock. Now, a number of our leaders, mine included in the UK, have described this as a war against an invisible enemy. And the challenge we have on our topic is that we need to win the peace. And that may not be easy because the costs of fighting the pandemic will diminish the capacity of governments, businesses, and financial institutions to tackle the next crisis. We should acknowledge that. But if we can come together to meet one of the biggest challenges in medical biology, so too can we come together to meet the biggest challenge in climate physics. And the limited experience with such major events is that afterwards, society's aspirations focus not just on the rate of growth, but on its direction and quality. After all, after the global financial crisis, the goals were to rebalance from the financialization of our economies, the goals to end too big to fail, and more recently to build stakeholder capitalism. So it's reasonable to expect that following this crisis, expectations coalescing around improvements in social support and medical care, greater attention to be paid to managing tail risks, and yes, that more heed is given to the advice of scientific experts, as Mindy mentioned at the start. So as the world tackles the COVID crisis, those of us who aren't on the front lines, either of healthcare, and I salute those who are, or macroeconomic policy, and I'm no longer on the front lines of macroeconomic policy, our job is to continue our work. And for us, that means continuing to develop the necessary frameworks to finance a smooth transition to a net zero economy. And the point is that private finance will have a critical role to rebuild an economy that aligns with net zero. Now, prior to this crisis, there was considerable momentum. Every major systemic bank, all the world's largest insurers, the biggest pension funds, top asset managers were calling for disclosure of climate-related financial risks through their support of the TCFD. And through Ceres leadership, investors controlling over $40 trillion in assets wanted to see transition plans to a low-carbon world from their portfolio companies. Our objective for the private finance work of COP26 is simple. We want to build on that momentum, build on what the Ceres membership has been focused on, which is to ensure that every major financial decision, every wholesale private financial decision takes climate change into account. And so we want to work with you to put in place the right market frameworks so you can do what you do best, which is to allocate capital to manage risk, but really to seize the opportunities associated with the transition to net zero. And the way we've organized this is principally around 3 R's, reporting, risk management, and returns. And I'll just briefly mention each of the three. On reporting, and you're well familiar with this, what we want to do for COP26 is to refine and implement the TCFD disclosures. We've got a lot of support from the institutions on this call. We want your input to those standards, and then we want to work with authorities to create pathways to make this climate reporting mandatory. So it is there's a comprehensive coverage. We're helped by the fact that 9 of 10 of the world's top asset managers, all the credit rating agencies, accounting firms, shareholder advisory groups back the TCFD. We're helped by the 140 of the world's largest companies through the World Economic Forum have backed it through something called the IBC, and of course the UNPRI's announcement that all of the 2,200 plus signatories to the UNPRI must make TCFD disclosures or risk ejection from that group. But you're the main users of this information, and you have an opportunity to shape it. And in particular, we'd encourage you to contribute to the current review of the TCFD framework. Tell them what's important, what's less so, what should be refined to ensure those disclosures are as decision useful as possible, and let's make sure this is as efficient as possible. So on the disclosures, feed in, let's focus on what's decision useful, let's make this efficient. That's this year's job. Commit to disclosing the full set in the 2021-22 round, and then demand it, obviously, from your portfolio companies. Demand that TCFD disclosure from those companies. And what we'll do in parallel is work with countries and jurisdictions like the European Union, like the UK, and international standard setters, the FSB, the IFRS, and IOSCO, as best as possible to get these approaches to making it mandatory. The second step is around better climate risk management. That needs to go obviously beyond the static to the strategic, and really focus on companies and financial institutions' plan to manage their emissions down. That's why the Bank of England became the first regulator to start a stress test of its major banks and insurers against different climate pathways, including the catastrophic business as usual scenario, the ideal but still challenging transition to net zero by 2050, and a late policy action or climate Minsky moment scenario that could bring a sudden recognition of the scale of stranded assets and the economy-wide disruption that a delayed and disorderly transition would bring. What the stress test is designed to do is to reveal the financial firms, and by extension the companies that they lend to or exposed to that are preparing for the transition, and those that aren't. And what we're doing as part of the stress test is to create scenarios and then share them with something called the NGFS, which many of you will know is a coalition of almost 60 central banks and regulators that represent about 2/3 of the world's emissions. And those stress scenarios of the NGFS, so agreed by this broader group, will be made public, made open source, so that any company, any investor in any sector can use them and adopt them to assess strategic resilience of either portfolio companies or their portfolio as a whole. The other things we're doing as authorities is to encourage the financial sector, and certainly the companies we supervise, to build capability within their firms. This has to become a core competency for banks and insurers, in other words, assessing climate risk. Secondly, to share knowledge and expertise. We should acknowledge that this is a nascent field, and we need to move rapidly to improve our skills. And in the UK, we've established something called the Climate Financial Risk Forum to do that. Anyone is welcome to join that if you wish. And then, of course, we're working with other regulators to expand stress testing. I mentioned the NGFS. We now are at 15 other authorities and counting who have committed to apply stress testing in their jurisdictions. Now, let me turn quickly to returns, and this is something that Mindy mentioned in her opening remarks. We know that the transition is going to affect every company in our economies. We also know that your ultimate clients or citizens are demanding increasingly climate action. And asset owners and asset managers will increasingly need to disclose whether their clients' money is being invested in line with those values. And thus far, the approaches you would know well have been somewhat inadequate. ESG metrics are worthy, but they're dominated by the S and the G. Carbon footprints per dollar invested obviously is not forward-looking. And the impact of shareholder engagement is incredibly important, and I'd underscore the importance of it. It's one of the 4 elements of the strategy that was mentioned at the start, but it's hard to measure. And taxonomies, such as EU taxonomies, they have some attractions, but a whole economy transition is not about only funding deep green activities or blacklisting, dark brown ones, if you will. We need 50 shades of green to catalyze and support all companies towards net zero and assess collectively whether we're moving towards being Paris aligned. So given that net zero is an imperative of climate physics and a commitment of 120 countries, we would expect that companies, banks, insurers, and investors will increasingly be expected to develop and disclose their transition plans. And for companies, and I know this is a focus of Climate Action 100, and applaud you for it, it means for those companies commitment to a target, ideally scope 3 by a specific date, assessment and disclosure of how that transition will affect the business model, short-term milestones so you can track progress, and detail of governance arrangements to oversee it, including whether executive compensation is tied to success and how risks are managed at the board level. Now, there are several possible ways for the providers of capital, in other words, those on the call, to disclose, and this is, I think, one of the big challenges we have in the run-up to COP, is to figure out the best ways of doing this, namely to disclose the extent to which your portfolios are well aligned for the transition, or at least what progress is being made, in a maybe ascending order of difficulty, and we're open to ideas on this. One could start with just the percentage of assets that actually are TCFD disclosure, have the TCFD disclosure. Secondly, the percentage of assets that you judge are net zero aligned, or at least have strategies or commitments to net zero. Progress on transition, third approach would be progress assessed against industry-specific transition pathways to help identify leaders and laggards. And then fourthly, the most ambitious and in many respects complex approach, which is to assess the degree warming potential of the portfolio, which assesses the quality of transition plans relative to Paris goals. And there are some leading firms that do voluntarily disclose this information, and we are doing work as part of the TCFD to consider this and other approaches, other metrics, and what are the most effective ways to measure how well asset portfolios are positioned for the transition. So encourage engagement with that. And we really do want to lever the success of Climate Action 100, the expertise and focus of groups like Climate Action 100 or the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and the UNPRI to build a coalition of asset managers and asset owners who expect their portfolio companies to meet the requirements of Paris. Just a couple of final words. We're going to supplement this work on risk reporting and returns with work with the multilateral development banks and development finance institutions for their role in mobilizing blended finance for adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, and to align their own portfolios. And then finally, what we want is really to channel your expertise and experience and ingenuity to develop those other innovative approaches that would best meet the biggest challenges to net zero. So a few examples would be understanding whether there's new financial products such as transition bonds or use of transition indices that can make a real difference, and we will support efforts to scale them up as rapidly as possible. So I just underscore there's a lot of innovation out there. The importance is whether it's really going to move the needle, and if your judgment is that it will, we will get behind it. We will work with the insurance sector on promoting innovations around contingent liability structure for climate policy risk and microinsurance. And the third thing we will look to do is to evaluate prospects for private markets in carbon offsets and nature-based solutions. We all know these are essential for the final solutions, and we want to draw heavily on private expertise in creating and running efficient, transparent market infrastructure. So to conclude, what we're looking to do is, as part of the private finance agenda, as part of COP26 and partnership with Italy, is to help build the foundations of a system that will be able to seize the opportunity to net zero. And if I can just finish by alluding back to the announcement to the nation last night of the UK Prime Minister, who alluded to the Corona challenge as being one of the greatest since the Second World War. I would remind that when that war was finished, the rallying cry in the UK, in the United Kingdom, was to build an England, quote, fit for heroes. And the subsequent decade brought in great transformations to British society, to the social safety net, to health, the health service and education. And as Mindy said at the start, once this war is over, may the challenge really to be create a planet that's fit for our grandchildren. And may our ambition and impact be just as bold and transformative as then. And with that, I will hand it back. I apologize that you can't see me, although many of you will be grateful. And I look forward in a few moments to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And again, apologize for the technical difficulties, but we were happy to see you earlier when we started out the day. So maybe it'll get fixed between now and the end. But for now, let me say again, thank you for your thoughtful insights and for your tremendous leadership in linking the role of the financial markets to addressing the climate crisis. And a reminder to all of our attendees, we are going to have a brief Q&A period with Mr. Carney at the end of the session. So if you have any questions for him, please be entering them now into the chat box that you'll see located on your control panel, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end of the session. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Betty Yee, California State Controller and board member of two of the largest public pension funds in the United States, CalPERS and CalSTRS. And also, I'm proud to say, an active and much appreciated board member of Ceres. Betty, you've heard Mr. Carney's reflections on the need for the finance sector to step up climate action, and you've advanced those similar principles in your own work, clearly. So as one of the leaders of the investor agenda, would you please share some of the actions that you feel CalPERS and CalSTRS have taken, or maybe even need to take, to accelerate action on the climate crisis?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dawn. Good morning or good afternoon to some. First of all, my best wishes to everyone for their continued wellness and continued health and safety. And just thank you everyone for joining this discussion today. Obviously, the global pandemic is front and center as our immediate and pressing threat, but our closing window to address climate change just doesn't allow us to simply let this issue fall by the wayside. And I want to thank Mark for a very comprehensive, just really context for our work going forward. And what I will say about investors is that we've been on this trajectory, and we remember the early conversations focused on ESG and trying to put together ESG plans that would be incorporated in all of our investment decisions. And obviously the E is taking more of a sense of urgency. And so we are accelerating our work there. We are certainly looking at expanding our opportunities in terms of where we place our assets. But I will say that the audience has changed around this as well. So it's not just that we are looking out for the 3 million, particularly on CalPERS and CalSTRS, the 3 million public employee members, as well as our teachers, but that we have members of the public, our student activists, our policymakers are now very, very focused on looking at investors, really helping to move this agenda forward. And so we have a lot more tools at our hand now than what we did when we first started this work just over a decade ago. So what I will say is this. Our work is constantly changing as we see more development in terms of the possibilities of moving and pursuing a low carbon transition. We did establish a comprehensive ESG plan in 2017 at CalPERS, which is constantly getting updated and revised because we know more. And the science is telling us more, and certainly the urgency is definitely accelerated in terms of our focused attention. In May of 2019, CalPERS approved a low carbon transition work plan. Again, ways of expanding our stewardship activities that supports the transition. We have all staff working proactively, identifying methodologies to assess our portfolio's climate risk exposure, and that work is ongoing. But over the past year, there's been a real shift, I think, in the way that investors are working together. Definitely seeing much more collaboration on moving our portfolios forward. engaging, much more robust engagement in the companies that we own, disclosing climate risks using TCFD framework. And I want to just applaud CalPERS, because I believe the next report that we owe to the legislature will be trying to look at scope 3 emissions and really trying to employ the TCFD framework of reporting. And then also engaging policymakers on major policy issues that particularly as it relates to carbon pricing. So the funds are doing all that we can to combine forces globally, scaling up our corporate action on climate. Just in the decades since we've started, both funds have started this, our role in the global effort to confront climate risk has grown tremendously. And I'm pleased that our funds are showing leadership in terms of voice and support for stable carbon pricing, and believing that a price on carbon is key to a global carbon reduction strategy. And so along those lines, both CalPERS and CalSTRS were represented at the Vatican Dialogue on Climate last summer, and we were able to reach agreement with investors, asset owners, the CEOs of our major oil companies, where the agreement and the statement essentially says that reliable and economically meaningful carbon pricing should be set by governments at a level that incentivizes business practices, consumer behavior, research and investment to significantly advance the energy transition, and it also must minimize costs to vulnerable communities. And so I think Mark's framework about looking at reporting, looking at the focus on risk and also on returns, the returns really are beyond what the portfolios of both funds are going to be showing, but really about what's going to happen with respect to the nature of our economy going forward and the productive nature of it in a hopefully a low carbon scenario. Both CalPERS and CalSTRS are members of Climate Action 100 Plus. This is a growing collaborative effort now with over just about 450 investors, about $40 trillion in assets under management. CalPERS is a leading engager at 20 of the focus companies. CalSTRS is also a leading engager in 8 of the companies. And we do this because this helps inform the work that we do with respect to our larger portfolio. And it also enhances our engagement with the rest of the companies in our portfolio. In September 2018, I was pleased to launch the investor agenda at the Global Climate Summit. And you've heard about the 4 pillars of that, but this was really the tool that was established to help investors and to encourage investors to look at how we look at moving away from investments that are in coal and other carbon intensive areas, looking at how we make our corporate engagement in this area more robust. Helping with investor disclosure, as well as the policy advocacy work that needs to continue to happen. Through the Capital Markets Accelerator Paris-aligned portfolio strategy, this is something I'm very proud of with respect to Ceres. We're working with investors to set science-based targets for portfolio decarbonization and implementing those targets with investor climate action plans. This is really exciting new work that I think will complement what Marcus just outlined. It sets a standard for what comprehensive portfolio alignment requires of every investor. And then this past September, during New York Climate Week, CalPERS became the first investor in the United States to join the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And what we mean by net zero is that we are talking about deeply reducing emissions with the remaining emissions fully offset, so that the net of these efforts actually get us to zero. Convened by the UN Environment Program and the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, the Alliance represents $4 trillion of assets under management. Its members are committed to transitioning our investment portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The 3 core focus areas of the Net Zero Alliance are advancing measurements and reporting, engaging portfolio companies, and engaging policymakers to create a regulatory environment that supports this goal. And the main difference from other initiatives is that rather than investors asking companies to do better on climate, we are committing to make that change from within. So this is a tall standard, but it is one that CalPERS has aggressively stepped up to. And if we believe that if replicated widely and with more action, that net zero gives us a 50-50 chance of reaching 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, highlighting how aggressive we have to be on confronting climate risk. Both funds, CalPERS and CalSTRS, recognize, and frankly with all other global investors, recognize the urgent and systemic risks that climate change poses to our members long term, and to our financial security of our members for sure, and the businesses in which we invest. We recognize that no single government or entity or no single investor for that matter can completely address climate, all of our climate challenges. So this really is a all hands on deck effort. And what I will say about this moment that we're in, and I think we're all pretty sanguine about the moment that we're in, is that there are really some opportunities, and Mindy addressed them, Elizabeth addressed them, Mark addressed them, but we are in this moment of where with crisis, and I know we know of the wise saying about how crisis breeds opportunity, but this was not meant to be opportunistic. This is to say that we are here, it is coinciding with the consequences that we must face with the pandemic. But I also think that the areas that can really help us begin to realize a sustainable and a healthy future together is about what we do with every bit of private and public financing that is now being directed towards rebuilding our economy, to look at where we've had vulnerabilities, and to be sure that there is a climate risk component with respect to whether it's economic stimulus, whether it's interest rate reductions, whether it's looking at any kind of quantitative easing policy, that we have climate risk front and center with respect to every dollar that we are putting to work. So we are here to step up, CalPERS and CalSTRS. We are happy about our partnership with our investors around the globe, and certainly are going to be part of the effort that Mark Carney will be leading shortcoming in the future. This is doable. There are a lot more tools available to us. What I want to say to other investors is that we have a lot of support to do this work together. And I know that together, and recognizing the urgency to accelerate, to expand our efforts, that we have every chance of promising our children and our grandchildren that we are leaving you a healthy and sustainable future.
Thank you, Betty. As always, your comments are both thoughtful and thought-provoking, as well as inspirational. And now we turn it over to our next speaker, Peter Damgaard Jensen, former CEO of the Danish pension fund PKA and the chair of the European Institutional Investors Group on climate change. Peter, along the lines of Betty's comments, would you speak to the type of actions that the European investors are taking to address the climate crisis, as well as where you see the greatest leadership gaps? We know that PKA has made a significant new commitment, along with the Danish government and other Danish investors, to invest $50 billion towards a low carbon economy. Would you tell us more about this commitment and the opportunities it creates for investors, as well as other steps that PKA plans to take on the climate crisis?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me and also setting up this conference. And in spite of all the difficulties we all have with the corona crisis, and I agree with the other speakers that what we actually need to work on for the moment, all of us, of course, is the pandemic, but there will be a day after that, and then it's extremely important that we know how we will get back and work with the climate crisis. I will mention three areas where I think it's important that we strengthen the work. One of them has actually been mentioned, and I think it's one of the best international corporations I actually have seen, and that's Climate Action 100+. There's a tremendous work being done by very many investors around the globe, a lot of US investors organized by Cirrus, a lot of European investors organized by IIDCC and PRI, and also a lot of work done in Asia Pacific. And I think it's actually the first time we have seen something like that, that's not just only been for 1 year or for one occasion, but where we have worked together for a longer period. And I very much look forward to see what kind of goals we'll get when the first 5-year period has ended in 2022. I think we already have got some goals, but I think we have to strengthen the work. The second one has been mentioned a couple of times, and there I might put more focus on 2030. And why I'm mentioning 2030 is because if we are not doing anything in this decade, in the next coming decade, then it will be very difficult, even though that we will come net zero in 2050. If we don't do anything and we do it fast now, we'll have big problems looking ahead. And there I will point on two initiatives. The first one is that we in IIDC started I think it was 1 year ago, to find out together with our members what is a Paris-aligned portfolio. We have been discussing that, and a lot of saying we try to make our portfolio Paris-aligned. But if we look at the reality, then a lot of pension funds and also asset managers are struggling to find out how to do it. And we have got a huge interest from our members, and we have started some working groups on that. We have 70 members, a lot of the big asset managers and asset owners in Europe working on that. And we have actually started doing asset class by asset class because we think it's too complicated to take a whole portfolio, but of course we'll end up having something that covers that. And we have will hopefully present the first work on fixed income here during the spring. And then we'll continue with equity, private equity, infrastructure, and so on. And first of all, that will be a kind of recommendation and ideas on how to do it. And that will mean that we can have a more specific discussion on what we can do now. And there again, 2030 comes up again. Because if we don't do anything with our portfolio now, then it might be too late to try to change it in the 2030s or 2040s. So that's one thing I think is extremely important and where we have to work together. The other thing is the Danish initiative you mentioned, and we especially had the goal with the Danish government to set a goal for 2030. And we said actually because the Danish government was a leader in green investments this UN COP, so we focus on the green investments, and that actually means renewables, green bonds, also energy efficiency, but we concentrated on that to keep it simple. And we actually asked the Danish pension funds about their commitments, and it shows. And that was a figure that was $50 billion the funds would focus on or would set as a goal for 2030. Of course, it takes that we also will get the green investment opportunities. So there's also a lot of work to be done by governments really to push forward on the green agenda. And that actually means that's in 2030, then 10% of the assets from the Danish pension fund would be invested in the green area. And I think it's very important to set that signal also to governments to say that if governments, both local governments and central governments, actually are pushing in the green direction, then we as asset owners and hopefully also asset managers are ready to make the investments. In PKA, we are already at 8% of our portfolio. That's $3 billion. And part of that is actually invested in US, where we can find a lot of opportunities, even though that politically it might not seem like that. There are opportunities in US, we think. But we will spread that out and hopefully do some outreach, first of all here in Europe, but also in US to try to create a momentum going up to Glasgow, to show that investors are actually ready to change their portfolios and invest more green. At the beginning, of course, it might be difficult if you haven't done it, but you have to develop your tools, you have to develop your competences so you're ready to invest in that area. And so those initiatives, I think, will get a push also for 2030. And then finally, I will say, I agree with the other speakers. We have to be aware of that when this crisis is over, we have to, I think it might be necessary, I'm not a national economic, but it might be necessary to do some kickstarting of the economy. And this have to be not to be a black kickstarting, this have to be a green kickstarting. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We very much appreciate your leadership over the years. And while you've retired from PKA, we're thrilled to be able to continue working with you through our longstanding collaboration with IIGCC. And now we have a few minutes remaining for a question and answer period with Mark Carney. If you've not done so, please submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So Mark, first, let us begin by wishing you a happy belated birthday. Despite what you said, you're looking younger and ready to take on the challenges ahead. So thank you for that. The first question out of the box from several people is about what actions and investors, businesses, financial regulators, and other market actors can take to support a successful outcome at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, assuming that the COP is able to proceed. And specifically, what kinds of actions and reforms should be prioritized on climate change at this particular moment to accelerate the economy and the whole transition to a net zero?
Thank you, Don. And that goes to the heart of it. I think I'd say a couple of things. One is that this will be a very high ambition COP. That's the commitment of the UK, of Italy, and certainly everyone who's aligned. And with respect to private finance, there are the first two areas that I outlined around reporting and risk. There is a fairly clear agenda, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's about execution. And part of that is in the public sector on execution, whether it's stress tests or pathways to mandatory. We need private sector feed in, we need to develop the competency. I think the area that I would really encourage the focus is exactly where Betty and Peter were, which is about being as clear. I mean, you have the leaders on this call, the presenters, and also around who are listening in, and is striking that balance on transition so that it is ambitious, it's clear, it has a horizon that is measurable and actionable. I do take Peter's guidance on 2030 as a way station. I mentioned shorter term metrics and tracking those being incredibly important, and also then the transparency out to the people we all ultimately serve. I mean, your clients, citizens. I do think that the demands for and entirely legitimate demands for understanding who is which pool of capital is well positioned for this and not, and being able to communicate that in as clear a way as possible is going to be essential for A, it's the right thing to do, B, it's also for the small p political economy of this to show that things are moving, and then C, actually what it does in answering that question, it forces a series of other questions up the investment chain and ultimately of companies to tell who's on the right or wrong side of history. So I think if I can stay with my 3 R's, I think it's around the returns bucket, and I really just underscore how much we want to continue to work with the individual and collective organizations on this call series, IIGC, the PRI, and constituent firms in those, and Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to come to consensus on how best to do that.
Thanks so much, Mark. And moving more specifically to asset managers like BlackRock and others that we've seen some real tangible movement over the last couple of months. Are there any specific challenges that large asset managers still need to address from your perspective, or any guidance you would give them about how they could tackle those challenges?
Well, the asset managers in general are behind, if I can put it that way, the asset owners. I think we can understand partly that's a difference in horizon of the asset owners. In many respects, the asset owners have been, in virtually all respects, at the frontier here in developing the frameworks and moving. So there's some catch up for the asset managers to do. They can do it quickly, though, now that there's a pathway there and there's commitment. Secondly, I do think that some of the, and this is a question, I think we have to look through this, is some of the bespoke products that can be developed, carbon light ETFs and others. I think full development of that opportunity is important for this. The third thing, though, which I think we would all recognize, is on the engagement side and being clearer, including on the passive side, in terms of engagement that is consistent with the transition. and consistent with the underlying values of the equity holders. And we've seen some welcome movement in that. And I think that this will be an important year over the course of the run-up to COP26 to see if that momentum is truly maintained. Certainly there is a huge amount of focus on it, and rightly so. So that level of engagement, including on the passive side, will be important. And if I can say one last thing, again, to reinforce what Peter was saying and what you think about this, which is that the definition or the coming to consensus, clarity, greater simplicity about what is Paris aligned, or maybe to use language that people on the street would recognize more, which is net zero aligned. What that actually means will be important, and therefore, the immediate work of groups like Climate Action 100 and others, and the IIGC is hugely important.
Thanks so much. We have time for just one quick comment that's a little US centric before we wrap up. And the question is about the United States SEC. And if you have any guidance for us or suggestions on the methodologies for more directly and effectively addressing climate change, working with that regulatory agency.
Well, I think continuing to engage with the SEC, I've fully encouraged that. Had a number of constructive conversations with the chair, Chair Clayton. As you know, there's a range of opinions amongst the commissioners. I think probably there's a threshold, as there should be, on materiality, but that's true for all of us. We wouldn't be looking at it if we didn't think it was material. Elements of, I think one of the challenges to thread in the US particularly, and I'll finish with this, is how companies can disclose strategic resilience. In other words, forward-looking. Forward-looking. I mean, they're not forecasts, but that's the important thing. It wouldn't be seen as forecasts, but forward-looking scenarios that would have an element of safe harbor because they're scenarios around certain climate pathways, but not forecasts of business performance. And I think working on that issue with the SEC would be a productive way of getting the types of disclosure that's necessary to judge who has a strategy for net zero and who doesn't in a consistent manner. Now, fortunately, that is one of the elements of the TCFD framework, and that is one of the elements we would like to, I think the TCFD would like to refine, if at all possible, so that that type of disclosure could be consistent across jurisdictions. If that makes sense.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. And it is so great to have you with us today. I'm sorry we're out of time to take any more questions, but we look forward to continuing the conversation with you, Mark. There are so many issues at hand here that we need to address collectively, and we could use your insight and leadership on. So thank you so much for taking part today. And I also want to thank all of our speakers, our co-hosts, and sponsors who have made this first digital session of the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk possible. Please note that we're going to send you a follow-up with a recording of this session. And for those of you who have actually registered for Series 2020, there's going to be another live stream session that'll take place tomorrow at 12 noon. So please join us for that discussion on reimagining capitalism in a world on fire and scaling up action to tackle the climate crisis with Harvard School professor Rebecca Henderson, Helen Wild-Smith, Stewardship Director of CCLA, and hopefully all of you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Carney. The session is now adjourned.